Welcome, Sunday school teachers and Bible study leaders, to our Explore the Bible overview of Matthew 28, 1 through 10 and 16 through 20 for Easter Sunday, April 17th, 2022, with the title of Risen. One way that you could introduce the lesson this week would be to just talk with your class. What is your favorite Easter song or Easter hymn? A lot of folks are going to have some strong feelings about why a particular song would minister to them. So I think that could lead into a good time of sharing and be a good icebreaker for your class. You might have one prepared from your own experience just to lead off and help the others to get started. But I think that could be a good way to do that. And after you've talked about that for a minute, now today we're taking a break from our study of 1 Thessalonians to look at the story of the resurrection of Jesus for Easter Sunday from here in Matthew 28, 1 through 10 and 16 through 20. I would probably divide this study up into two sections with those two scriptures. First of all, the resurrection story itself in verses 1 through 10, and then what I would call the response to the resurrection in verses 16 through 20. So begin looking at that, verses 1 through 10, the resurrection begins. Mary Magdalene, after the Sabbath, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to look at the grave. Talked about this last year, I know, when we were in Luke, I believe, but you can't really ignore the point here, the significance of the fact that these are women. The first ones to get the news were women. The first ones to share Jesus' resurrection were women. Christianity is so often portrayed as being harsh on women, but it really elevates women, especially in its original historical context where women were treated as second-class citizens. In John Stark's book, The Triumph of Christianity, he writes, Jewish women, quote, had no right to bear witness, could not expect credence to be given to anything they reported. As Rabbi Eliezer is quoted in the Babylonian Talmud, 90 AD, better burn the Talmud than teach it to a woman. Indeed, elsewhere the Talmud advises everyone who talketh much with a woman causes evil to himself. That's on page 124 of Stark's book. N.T. Wright, a New Testament scholar in Britain, writes, it's fascinating that in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John we have Mary Magdalene and the other Marys and the other women. And Mary Magdalene, of all people, we know she had a very checkered career in the past, is chosen as the prime witness. There she is in all four accounts. He says, as historians, we are obliged to comment that if these stories had been made up 5 years later, let alone 30, 40, 50 years later, they would have never had Mary Magdalene in this role. To put Mary there is from the point of view of Christian apologists wanting to explain to a skeptical audience that Jesus really did rise from the dead, like shooting themselves in the foot. But to us as historians, this kind of thing is gold dust. The early Christians would never have made this up. The stories of the women finding an empty tomb and meeting the risen Jesus must be regarded as solidly historical. That's N.T. Wright, writing in the appendix of Anthony Fleur's book, There Is a God, pages 206 and 207. So how striking that God appointed these women to be the first witnesses of the gospel. It says something about the high place that God has for women. And as Wright said, it's a strong factor in favor of the authenticity of this biblical account. No one would have just made it up this way. But the one question you might ask your class, especially those of you who are teaching women, ask ladies, are you being faithful to be his witness today, like Mary and the others were in their day? Then verse 4 says, when the angel appeared, the Bible says the soldiers were terrified and became like dead men. Really amazing when you think about it. These hardened soldiers would be so afraid of what they saw that they would literally pass out. We can only imagine the power and the glory of that angel who appeared. One angel. And Jesus said he could call however many thousands of angels. And in light of verse 4, it's almost comic that in verse 5, the angel said to the women, do not be afraid. Seriously? I mean, these soldiers just passed out. But at least they didn't pass out. More kudos to the women. But verse 6 is perhaps the great message of Christianity. He is not here, for he is risen, just as he said. If Jesus had stayed in that tomb, there would be no Christianity. The message of Christianity is that Christ has risen. Christianity would be on the ashes of history like so many others if Jesus had not risen from the dead. In the 1990s, David Koresh led a cult group named the Branch Davidians. He claimed to be the Christ. As many of you know, he was tragically killed by government forces in the storming of his compound outside of Waco in 1993. But immediately after Koresh died, some of his followers said, listen, David prophesied that he was going to rise again from the dead on the third day. But he didn't. In fact, you can go see the grave of David Koresh today. It is still occupied. It is there at Tyler Memorial Park in Tyler, Texas. If he was alive, that would be one thing, but he isn't, and that ended it. But what distinguishes Jesus over every other religious figure in all of history is that he did rise from the dead. Romans 1 said he was declared, Romans 1:4 says he was declared the Son of God with power by the resurrection from the dead. In other words, of all the religious figures, of all the prophets, of all the so-called gods all through history, God said, this one is my son. And he indicated who it was by raising him from the dead. It is the single greatest fact in history, the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. And notice that verse 6 says, he is risen just as he said. This is important. The resurrection of Jesus didn't just come out of nowhere. The Old Testament prophesied it, and Jesus himself indicated beforehand that that was going to happen. The Jewish religious leaders referred to his prediction. In Matthew 27, they said, this man indicated he was going to rise from the dead. So he didn't just do it, he called it in advance. Like in basketball, you hit some crazy shot, it's one thing. If you hit it by accident, it's another thing if you call it in advance. I'm going to spin around, I'm going to bank this shot off the backboard underhanded. You planned it out and you called it. That's another thing. And that's what Jesus did here. He didn't just rise from the dead. He called it. He called it in advance. The disciples had been told, the Jews knew, the Romans knew, but despite the best efforts of many of them to foil it, he did it anyway. He called it. He rose again from the dead, just as he said. And he gave the invitation, come, see the place where he was lying. That invitation is still open today. People can still be invited to come see the place where he was lying. It is still there. Unlike David Koresh's grave in Tyler, Texas, Jesus' grave is still there, empty, for he has risen. And I think it's interesting then, verse 7, where he says, behold, I've told you. In other words, the angel's saying, listen, I've done my part. I've told you. I've done what I've been instructed to do. The rest, it's up to you to respond now. And that's something like our job too. Our job is to share the message. We're not responsible for how people respond to it. In fact, we could even say like the angel did, listen, behold, I've told you. I've done my part. Well, speaking then of our response, that brings us to the second section, verses 16 through 20. So what did the disciples do in response to the resurrection of Jesus, and what should we do in response to his resurrection? You might ask your class, just by way of introduction into this section, how should we respond to the resurrection of Jesus? What do we see here in these verses that shows us how we should respond to the resurrection of Jesus? Well, a couple things. First of all, we see worship. It says when they saw him, they worshiped him. Listen, if Jesus has risen from the dead, we should worship him in our own personal worship times and corporately in the church. See this in verse 9 too. It says, and behold, Jesus met them and greeted them. They came up and took hold of his feet and worshiped him. This tells us how we should worship him. In a little more detail, we respond in humility and worship. They took hold of his feet and worshiped him. The feet were considered to be an unclean part of a person in the Eastern world. People wore sandals. They walked in filthy streets. So that's why they would wash their feet to get all that dirt and muck off. So taking hold of his feet was a mark of humility, but they took hold of his feet and worshiped him. Humble worship is the proper response to Jesus. It's what characterized the Magi who first met him as a child. Matthew 4:11 tells us they too 2:11 tells us they too fell to the ground and worshiped him. From the first of Matthew to the last, the response is the same: humility and worship, and that should guide us in our response to Jesus today. How should we respond to him if he's risen from the dead? Worship him. Worship him in your own daily personal devotional times. Worship him corporately with other Christians. And you might ask your group, they humble themselves to worship Jesus. What are some ways that we can humble ourselves and worship him today? And see how they respond. I would suggest a few things. Sing out in worship. Sing without fear, without embarrassment. Sing out is a way of humbling yourself. Or humble yourself and raise your hand in worship. Takes humility. You're not worried about what people think. Just worship him in that way. Or kneel. Humble yourself and kneel before the Lord in worship. Or go to the front and pray and humble yourself at the invitation time. And your class may think of others too. But it's good for us to humble ourselves and worship the Lord. So one response to his resurrection is to worship. Another response we see is to obey that great commission that we find at the end of this passage. And so you might ask your class, what does Jesus tell us to do here? Of course, a lot of people are going to first say, go. Actually, and we should go, but actually in the Greek language, the only command in this section is make disciples. Make disciples. The others are participles. As you're going, baptize and teach, but make disciples is the command. And so if Jesus has risen from the dead, we need to be making disciples. And notice he doesn't say make converts. He says make disciples. And you might ask the question, what's the difference between making converts and making disciples? Well, converts may be somebody who makes a decision or fills out a card or whatever. A disciple is a genuinely committed learner or follower. And you might ask your class to consider personally, are you a convert or are you a disciple? But he's given us the command here to make disciples and also baptize them and then teach them to observe all that I commanded you. And notice, it's not just teach them all I commanded you, but teach them to observe all I commanded you. Teach them to do all that I commanded you. It's lordship. Lordship. If Jesus is really risen from the dead, then we need to respond by worshiping him, and we need to respond by obeying the Great Commission that he gave us. We've talked a lot about that in our own church in recent days. How are you involved in mission? Jesus gave us that Acts 1:8 command to be his witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the earth. Where are you involved in that? Our church has a mission partnership in Bulgaria, another with the Texas Port Ministry, reaching people around the world. There are many others. You talk about your church's mission partnerships. Maybe just review what they are and share with your class how they can be involved in mission, starting in their own Jerusalem, right there in your town with visitation and ministry, and through missions, giving and praying and going to the ends of the earth. If Jesus has risen from the dead, we need to respond in worship. We need to respond in obeying this commission that he gave us. A couple of years ago, someone in our church loaned me one of the best books I've ever read called Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus by a former strict Muslim by the name of Nabil Qureshi, Qureshi. In the book, Qureshi talks about how after attending a debate at Regent University between a Muslim and a Christian, he admitted to his friends, Gary, Mike, and David, that the resurrection seemed to be the best explanation of the historical facts about Jesus. So his friend David said, "So Nabil, are you a Christian yet?" And Qureshi said, "In your dreams," and he punched his friend David in the shoulder and said, "We still haven't looked at whether Jesus claimed to be God, which is a bigger issue to me. Plus, when it comes time to investigate Islam, you'll see how strong our arguments can be." He said, as far as arguments go, the only thing Christianity has over Islam is the resurrection. Gary looked at Mike as if he couldn't believe what Nabil had just said, and he said, "The only thing we've got is the resurrection? Buddy, that's all we need." Qureshi's friend Gary was exactly right, and Nabil Qureshi would soon discover that for himself too. If Christ really is risen from the dead, that's all we need. It's all we need for our own salvation. That's all we need to face death with no fear. That's all we need to give direction for our lives and to minister to others. If the resurrection of Jesus is true, and it is, that's all we need. All right, well, I hope that God will help you to convey the power of the message of the resurrection of Jesus through his Holy Spirit for your class and for your guests this Sunday. Remember, we'll be back to 1 Thessalonians 5 next week, and the return of the Lord. I plan to have some helps for you with that lesson next time. Hope to see you again soon. Remember, if you leave something in the comment section, I'll be sure to pray for you and for your group this week.